Do you want to make these accusations against Nigel Farage the centrepiece of your political communication? I mean, 2 weeks ago, Ed Davey was complaining about the BBC giving Nigel Farage too much publicity, given that he's only got 5 MPs.
I can't imagine a Labour leader's speech in my lifetime which had fewer references to the Conservative Party than this one.
Almost none.
Mentioned.
Almost none.
Barely mentioned. I felt recently, Ed, you've been trying to out-posh me with Downton Abbey and Chevening.
George, there is no way I could out-posh you. No way. So greetings. We are not in the studio today. Disappointingly, we are remote recording, and so I'm staring into a computer screen, seeing George with a Ming vase behind him.
Well, I wish it was a Ming vase. Sadly, it's not. But I am aware that Darren Jones, he's the new Labour MP who's in charge of Downing Street, said this week that Labour politicians were always trying to outpour each other, always trying to say that they had a worse upbringing and a tougher upbringing. And it was a bit like that famous comedy sketch with John Cleese and people, the Four Yorkshiremen, saying that they'd been born in a kind of pothole in the road. And I felt recently, Ed, you've been trying to out-posh me with Downton Abbey and Chevening. Anyway, I've delivered
George,
the
there is
trump
no
card.
way I could out-posh you. No way.
Well, I thought so, but I was getting worried. Anyway, I've been to stay at Chatsworth this week. I took the British Museum trustees to an away day at their amazing facilities there. And we were incredibly well looked after. And it's a very impressive team. And we engaged with local stakeholders. We've got local MPs around to talk to us. But I feel like order has been restored.
Were you twirling your bow tie above your head at 5 a.m. standing on a table in the Great Banquet Hall?
No.
I.e., was it just like the old days? Was it just like the old days?
Is that what you were doing at Chevening?
Definitely, I've definitely not. Never done such a thing. Well, I am. Don't worry. I think your credentials are just exemplary. Although as somebody who didn't go to Eton, they're not quite exemplary enough to be at the top table of posherati.
I just accept the crumbs from their table. Always have.
Well, a lot of crumbs. I think we should just welcome a new show into the fraternity of political podcasts. I'm going to refer to it later on, but there's a new podcast, The State of It, from the team at the Times and the Sunday Times. I think their first episode dropped yesterday, being made by Caroline Wheeler, the massive story getter on the Sunday Times, and her colleague Gabriel Pogrund, who's got some great scoops over recent years. And he's the co-author with Patrick Maguire, the third person in the podcast. We often talk about Patrick as the writer of the books about Keir Starmer, but also the oracle about Labour, and their political editor, Steve Swinford. So a new podcast. We wish them luck. And in fact, as I said, I'm going to quote from them later.
What happened to that Times podcast with Peter Mandelson? Why don't they revive that now that Peter's available?
Well, that is a good question. With I think Danny Finkelstein was one of his co podcasters. I think Sally Morgan took his place, and maybe they decided she was better.
But of course, it was talking about Ming vases. Of course, it was Peter Mandelson who came up with that famous phrase about Ming vases and having to carry them across shiny floors. And we should, let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today, because having won that big election a year ago, having carried the Ming vase across the shiny floor, we should talk about the Labour conference a year into office, shouldn't we? Keir Starmer's speech, the attack on Farage's response, and the Conservative conference, which is about to get underway. But let's start with the Labour conference. It's come to an end. It's 2 days after Keir Starmer's big speech, which I think was the dominant event of the conference. What did you make of it, Ed? Let's just go straight in. What did you think of the big speech? Because you had said earlier on this podcast in the weeks before the conference, this was going to be an absolutely critical speech for the Prime Minister.
There's no doubt that Keir Starmer comes out of the Labour conference politically stronger than he went in, certainly within the parliamentary party and in the Labour Party, although that's because he went in a very weak position with that kind of rolling assault from Andy Burnham, the news that that Keir Starmer was the most unpopular leader in British political history, the early days of the conference dominated by, would Keir Starmer need to be removed over the next year if Labour were to recover their opinion poll lead and take on Reform and others at the next general election. And I think that his speech definitely stabilised the situation internally. It was a speech which was, delivered in a Keir Starmer way. I mean, he's not the great orator, but he had a very strong response in the hall, lots of standing ovations. I think it was revealing about him. I sat and watched the whole thing, and I thought it was the best speech I've seen him give. There was lots of authentic Keir Starmer moments and some big political message. And in the immediate aftermath, the talk was that he's bought himself time. But I think if you look at the unfolding commentary in the 48 hours after, the commentary basically says nothing's really changed. The big moment this autumn is going to be the budget, a very difficult budget where taxes are going to have to go up substantially. And even if they don't break the manifesto pledges, and the government spent all week saying they stand by their manifesto, which has been slightly hard to understand what they quite mean by that. It's certainly going to break the pledge from Rachel Reeves a year ago not to raise taxes again in this parliament. And then on the basis of these opinion polls, the local elections and the Welsh elections next May look very challenging for Labour across the UK. And I guess it gets to a kind of a bigger point about conferences and how you go about them. And neither you or I were at the Labour Party conference this year. And sometimes that's a disadvantage if you're wanting to understand what is going on politically. And sometimes it's an advantage, because my sense is that within the Labour halls, actually the mood really improved. That ministers who've had a torrid year suddenly found they went to events where they got clapped and cheered and people wanted selfies. And Keir Starmer made a speech which absolutely roused feeling in the hall. And the truth is, for Labour, if you commit to reducing child poverty and absolutely lambast Nigel Farage and Reform, you're pretty guaranteed a strong response in the hall. But the test is, how's it being seen outside the hall, outside the Labour conference, through the television screen to voters around the country? And that, in a sense, was the perspective that you and I have had, because we weren't on the inside. And it did feel to me a conference which was talking to itself. Keir Starmer had a big political task to turn round his standing internally, and he did a bit of that, although it looks as though it's going to be challenging for his chosen deputy leadership candidate Bridget Phillipson to see off Lucy Powell in the deputy leadership election, which is unfolding. But out there in the country, people worrying about the cost of living and the economy, what's changed? Worrying about what's happening on our borders, small boat crossings, immigration, a very big salient issue now in the opinion polls, in the National Health Service, waiting times. None of those things have changed. And I'm not sure that at this conference, Keir Starmer was seeking to speak to the country. I think it was a very internally focused conference speech, and conference maybe necessarily because he had a big internal political confrontation with Andy Burnham and more widely to deal with. But when the commentators in the days after say nothing's changed and it's still very tough for Keir Starmer, the budget, the May elections, they're right. And I'm not sure this conference has changed that.
But I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but except to say I'm not that surprised, because I'm not sure a conference can change that mood in the country. That's not, a conference is just an event, and it's these days, of course, far less covered, probably far less watched than it would have been in an age when more people were tuning into the 10 o'clock news and reading the newspapers than they do today. Although I suppose the clips have gone all over social media. But I think Keir Starmer should be pretty satisfied with the last 4 days, given, as you say, where he started. I mean, I was, one of my favorite cartoonists is Peter Brooks in the Times, and he did a really brutal cartoon on Monday of Keir Starmer in Liverpool. That's where the conference was, essentially standing before the Labour faithful, and they're all kind of singing back to him. He's a real nowhere man sitting in his nowhere land, a bit of the, Mersey beat from the Beatles. And I think 4 days later, he's in a much stronger position internally. That's quite a thing to pull off when you start with such a febrile kind of conference environment and lots of talk of leadership. Andy Burnham, who, I like, but I mean, he turned up, effectively said, I'm a challenger, didn't say, I'm not talking about leadership, said, I'm happy to talk about leadership, and then ended up saying, oh, I'm not challenging for the leadership. And he, in fact, left the conference just before Keir Starmer spoke, which I don't think was necessarily the best look. And I think what came across was more of a sense of unity than you've seen from Labour in the last 6 months. So, if you ask yourself, what can you achieve in one conference? And I totally agree with you, you've got the budget and immigration challenges and all that coming up. But in terms of what can you achieve in one conference, particularly if you're the governing party, it's not the same as the opposition. Maybe the opposition, this is their only chance to speak to the country really during the year, whereas the government's got a chance every week. I would say, job done.
Were there particular things that you pull out? Maybe we should just talk about Nigel Farage first, because actually Keir Starmer chose from the Laura Kuenssberg interview last Sunday through his speech to raise the standing of Nigel Farage, to say that this was his opponent, that stopping a reform government was his purpose, and he was very disparaging in his speech, but also in the interviews. I mean, he referred to the reform immigration policy on indefinite leave to remain as racist to Laura Kuenssberg. But this is what he said in his conference speech about Nigel Farage, and actually gave Nigel Farage a platform to then issue a big public statement straight after the speech. Let's hear Keir Starmer first.
When was the last time that you heard Nigel Farage say anything positive about Britain's future? He can't. He doesn't like Britain, doesn't believe in Britain, wants you to doubt it just as much as he does. So he resorts to grievance. They all do. They want to turn this country, this proud, self-reliant country, into a competition of victims, saying to you, to working people, don't trust in each other. You can't fix this. This is not a great country.
And then Nigel Farage struck back within an hour.
I used to think the Prime Minister was a decent man, somebody that I could talk to and chat to. We might disagree on worldview, but I thought he was a profoundly decent human being. I am completely shocked at his behaviour. I hope when he wakes up tomorrow morning, he feels ashamed of what he has done. This is a desperate last throw of the dice from a Prime Minister who's in deep trouble. But I'm sorry to say, I now believe that he is unfit to be the Prime Minister of our country.
Well, I don't think Nigel Farage was shocked, or if he was shocked, he was only shocked because he's thrilled to be so centre stage. I mean, first of all, I can't imagine a Labour leader's speech in my lifetime which had fewer references to the Conservative Party than this one. I mean, the Conservative Party is barely mentioned.
Almost none.
Barely mentioned. There's certainly no mention of the Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch. And it's a very interesting decision, which I don't know whether sort of Labour, started by talking up Farage a year ago because they wanted to keep the right divided, and it was a good way of essentially confining the Conservative Party to the sort of margins of irrelevancy. And over the last year, they've increasingly started to think, well, not only is that a kind of a tactic to deal with the Conservatives, reform is our big threat. Certainly some of the Labour MPs I've spoken to the last couple of weeks are very clear that they see reform as the absolute central threat to them in their own constituencies. And I saw the headlines from the speech, and I normally think, your conference speech as a party leader is your only time you really get to sort of unpack all of your vision and your values and so on, even if you're the Prime Minister. And it's a bit wasted, therefore, if the headlines for the speech are an attack on an opponent rather than selling people about yourself. And that was my immediate reaction. I walked past a sort of one of those news billboards in the street that had an LBC headline that said, Starmer attacks Farage. I thought, what a waste of your speech. But the next morning I was thinking, well, maybe it is actually quite a clever tactic because it both united the whole in the way we've just described, united the Labour movement, and kind of sets up, doesn't it, Starmer as in a sort of triangulation position, which is, if you want, we can't move to the left, we can't move to the, if you don't want to have the extreme left and you want to have the extreme right, you've got me. And there are risks of doing that because if you're just the kind of anti-candidate, that's dangerous, as others have pointed out in the last couple of days. That's what Biden tried to do with Trump, saying, I'm the only person who can stop Trump. And in the end, people didn't kind of care and they voted for Trump. But I think it does provide a kind of coherent political narrative to what the Starmer government is about and what he's about, even if it's cast in this rather sort of negative terms of like, I stand for everything that Farage doesn't.
Look, there's no doubt that Keir Starmer over these next 3 years has to tackle the issues which are a big problem for the government in the eyes of a potential reform voter: the small boats, immigration, the borders, illegal working. And they also have got to turn around the kind of cost of living worries and get people feeling better off. So, absolutely, that is right. And secondly, you need people in your operation who are exposing what reform actually says on the economy. The sums don't add up. That their pledges are woolly or deeply unfair in certain aspects. The question is whether you want the Prime Minister to be the person who puts that centre stage in the way that Keir Starmer did. And also, on the one hand, using language of kind of race and racism to talk about reform policies, it immediately leads to, well, does that mean reform are racist? Is Nigel Farage racist? Are you racist if you think about voting reform? Labour politicians have spent the last 3 days saying, no, that isn't what they mean. I'm not sure whether explaining to voters who've got a legitimate worry that, no, we don't actually think you're racist is quite where you want to be. And then at the same time...
explicitly, sorry, just on that point, explicitly in his speech, Keir Starmer was saying that Labour had patronised working people in the past for their views on immigration and that it wasn't racist to have concerns about immigration. So he was obviously doing, I think, a bit of kind of course correction because the racism remark came in an interview rather than in the speech, right?
That's true, but it's run all week, partly supercharged by other politicians, cabinet members popping up and repeating different versions of it. And, clearly there's lots of Labour people who want to say that they are racist. And then you saw today, Keir Starmer was out in Copenhagen talking about asylum seekers and tightening the rules and repeating the announcement from early September that family resettlement has been put on hold because there's been a big rise in the number of people who are coming over, claiming asylum and then bringing their families over very quickly. But he called the asylum system a golden ticket. And again, do you want a Labour politician, a Labour Prime Minister, to be using that kind of language, a golden ticket to come to Britain? Keir Starmer needs to stop a leakage of votes from Labour over to reform, but that has been a small part of his polling challenge. His much bigger polling challenge is losing voters to the Liberal Democrats and to the Greens on the left, who will be, I think, pretty appalled by the idea that Keir Starmer suddenly thinks the asylum system has become a golden ticket. So, I'm sure you're right about talking about the policy issues which reform is highlighting. But you have to be careful that you don't hype up the rhetoric as opposed to hype up the delivery. But do you want to make these accusations against Nigel Farage the centrepiece of your political communication? 2 weeks ago, Ed Davey was complaining about the BBC giving Nigel Farage too much publicity, given that he's only got 5 MPs. Keir Starmer has given the green light to equality of treatment between Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage from now until polling day, whether that's next May or the general election 2 or 3 years' time. I'm not sure how wise this is for the Prime Minister, but he did it because under political pressure internally, that was absolutely a way to galvanise the conference hall. Just not sure how wise this politics is. What else did you notice in this speech?
I thought there were quite a few interesting bits in it. I thought, by the way, he's not the greatest orator, as you say, but I thought, as a sort of piece of rhetoric, it was well constructed, and there were a couple of very strong passages about the values he shared. There were a couple of strong passages about his values and the values of the Labour movement and the values of the country. And he kind of pulled out examples of people who helped in their community. And he said, look, Britain's not broken, and this is very different from the Britain you see on sort of social media clips. I thought that was interesting piece of rhetoric. And then I thought there's sort of other couple of things that caught my mind. The other couple of things that caught my attention. So first, I mentioned it before, the triangulation. He explicitly, in one paragraph, talks about, essentially people sort of selling snake oil merchants, a miracle cure. This is part of an attack on Farage. But then he goes, as examples, tax cuts that magically pay for themselves, a wealth tax that somehow solves every problem. The Brexit lies on the side of that bus. We can see these snake oil merchants on the right, on the left. And so he's eliding supporters of a wealth tax. There'll be plenty of Labour MPs who have advocated a wealth tax and hoping that Rachel Reeves will introduce a form of wealth tax in the budget. And he's eliding them with the Faragists. So I thought that was a pretty interesting piece of triangulation. And the other thing that caught my mind, particularly when it comes to the sort of where you position yourself politically, was an attack really on New Labour. I mean, he obviously doesn't say I'm attacking New Labour, but when he looks at kind of what's gone wrong in our country, he does say it wasn't just Brexit, and by implication, it's not just the Tory years. He says the global financial crisis is when we were exposed, when a new Britain should have been born, but we had placed too much faith in globalization. That immigration was a problem, that we hadn't renewed the infrastructure. We had an attitude that it didn't mind if industry leaves the country. I mean, that is an attack on kind of Blairite New Labour views around globalization around the turn of the millennium. Definitely. And he very deliberately dates it not to the election of a Conservative government or a coalition government in 2010, but to the global financial crisis when we're exposed. But that's after 11 years of Labour government that were exposed. I thought that was very interesting. And of course, there's no mention here in the speech of Tony Blair or Gordon Brown. There's no praise for their achievements either.
I have a slightly different take on that. Let me come to it in a second. First of all, I think you're right about the triangulation between kind of Andy Burnham and Liz Truss. I thought that was smart and well done in the speech. I think he's always in danger of a sort of slightly inauthentic feeling working class language because he needs his coalition to be broader than working class. And to be honest, Keir Starmer may have come from a working class background, but he doesn't look so working class anymore. But I thought the stuff he did around child poverty was very important, and the expanding higher education to higher education and apprenticeships was a good thing for him to do. I think on that political point, I know what you mean about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown not being mentioned and the financial crisis, but I heard it in a slightly different way. And this returns to something I think crops up in Keir Starmer speeches and has done for the last 5 years, and which I react badly to. I'm not sure it's anti-New Labour. I think it ends up being quite anti-politics. He started his speech with talking about Hillsborough and then the post office scandal and other scandals, and it was about politics having let you down. The state, government, the financial crisis was one in that list. That is true. But he actually was talking about politics having failed. And then later on, when he comes back into the end of the speech, he talks about mere politics cannot break Britain. And he talks about how people don't want control to go to politicians. They want it to go to real people. And it ends up being quite... Keir Starmer, I'm not really the politician like all the rest of you. We've talked in the past about him sort of attacking the Westminster culture. In the next 2 or 3 years, as Nigel Farage doubles down on the kind of anti-government, anti-Westminster, anti-civil service, anti-establishment, they're not on your side rhetoric, I just don't think Keir Starmer can attempt to compete with Nigel Farage as an anti-politician. He can't come at it from a populist. A Labour Prime Minister has got to persuade people that in values and purpose and optimism, He is about making things better, using the power of politics and government to make people's lives better. And his speech feels to me there's a tension between him wanting to talk about the good things he wants to do and the fact that all around him he sees politics failing. And, that sort of anti-politics populism, I don't think that's the right place for a Labour leader to be. It may be what he feels in his core. Keir Starmer, the lawyer, the director of public prosecutions, the guy who didn't really ever see himself as being a politician, but he is a politician now. He's the leader of the Labour Party. He's the Prime Minister of the country, and so that part of it just makes me concerned. That isn't the way to make people feel confident and believe that politics can make a difference in their lives.
I guess I would say maybe he's tapping in. It's naive to think you can just avoid the anti-politics mood in the country, and maybe he's sort of trying to harness that to his own benefit and indeed make something of his background, as you say, as someone who came late into politics and whom his critics say the problem is he's not enough of a politician. What else in the speech? Was there anything else that caught your attention?
I think the one other thing which I thought was very striking, and this goes to the way this Downing Street has operated and what they need to get better at in the next year and 3 years. But it was an omission, which was ID cards. Last week in our podcast, we said it looks like there's a big ID cards announcement coming, a big reform. We
got that right. Come on.
We got that right. It was a think tank report.
We were 24 hours in advance of everyone else. We said there was going to be a big ID cards announcement.
The big idea, patriotic renewal, the ID card as a way of tackling illegal working. ID cards weren't in the Prime Minister's speech at all, nor were they mentioned by any other cabinet minister that I could see. I mean, it barely mentioned throughout the week at all. It ends up, I mentioned that New Times podcast, The State of It, in their first episode.
Very generously, I thought you did.
I did. In their first episode, they talk about what they describe as, and this is in the Times today, cabinet backlash against digital ID to stop boats. All the cabinet, well, a number of cabinet ministers saying that this was presented as a fait accompli, came out of the blue, not clear it will do anything to stop illegal working, expensive, complicated. What will end up happening is they'll recreate what already exists, which is e-visas for migrants. And I mean, it wasn't mentioned. If the Friday before your conference, your big idea is ID cards, you've got to stick with it for more than 24 hours. There have been times when the government has done a good job of delivering in a strategic way. If you think, for example, of the way in which Steve Reid has gone about water regulation, the way in which David Lammy built up to Palestinian recognition, the preparing of an argument over a long period of time. You could say the same thing about Rachel Reeves and the fiscal rules and the importance of fiscal discipline. But the times when they've got into trouble of when the things have come out of the blue, winter allowance or welfare reform, without preparing the ground, and all the times when they say something, you remember Keir Starmer, his comments about migration, and then move away from it almost immediately. And they've got to find a way in which they prepare the ground and make the argument for something over a longer period of time, so the policy announcement becomes the answer to the question they've already raised, and then they then stick with it for more than 24 to 48 hours. I'm an ID card skeptic, I have to say, in terms of solving these problems. But if you announce it as the Prime Minister, you can't then drop it within 24 hours. And I suppose my worry about this conference, we said at the beginning, the budget is the big thing coming up in 2 months' time. Are they preparing the ground properly to explain to people what's happened over the last year, which means now a tax rise is the imperative? And it's half-hearted. Keir Starmer didn't really address this in his speech properly.
I think Rachel Reeves did a bit, didn't she? I mean, in her speech, she talked about tough choices to come, talked about changes over the last year, and started to make the link to the real world environment in which people pay higher interest rates if you don't control your public expenditure, which we've been urging her to do for the last year.
That is right. But this was a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who said, we fixed the foundations, we finished phase one. That was just a few weeks ago, that we've done the tax rises for the Parliament. And now they're in a position where there's a big fiscal gap and they're going to have to raise more taxes. And they've needed for the last year an argument to explain why this is a 5-year plan challenge, that it's about global economic uncertainty, the public finance deficit, a diagnosis of the growth problem, I still don't feel that they are making that argument in a way which is going to be understandable, even if it's not compelling when it comes to budget tax rises in the end of November. You are right that Rachel Reeves began to address that on Monday. But if I said to you, what is the reason why Rachel Reeves now thinks she needs a multi-billion-pound tax rise when last November she said it was all done for the Parliament? Could you tell me what the argument is?
No.
And that is a problem about the way they go about politics and communication.
What about the Conservatives? They're about to start their conference. I remember the second conference in opposition. I was working for William Hague, and it was absolutely miserable. I think the Sun put up a front page of William Hague as a dead parrot, like the Monty Python sketch, and the Tory party being dead. So, by the way, it's a reminder we've been here before, and then we had 14 years of Tory prime ministers. So the idea, I think, that political parties as old as the Conservative Party are finished forever is maybe wishful thinking on behalf of some people, probably not true. Look, the second conference in opposition is really tough. I mean, it was absolutely miserable. I remember I was there in 1998, and the Sun newspaper had this front page of a dead parrot, like Monty Python sketch for the Tory party, and the mood was funereal. And it's just a reminder, we did subsequently have 14 years of Tory prime ministers. So the idea that the Conservative Party is completely finished is not a new idea and has regularly been proved wrong in the past. But clearly there is this enormous problem of relevance. We've just been talking about Nigel Farage. Presumably Kemi Badenoch and the party high command is very worried there'll be another defection, because Danny Kruger, the Tory MP, defected a couple of weeks ago to kind of mar the start of the conference. I think the best answer, but it's going to be painful, and I've been there, is you've got to just start making an argument you're going to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat over the coming years, which is the Conservative Party is the party that is genuinely committed to business, genuinely committed to enterprise, genuinely committed to controlling public expenditure, and therefore genuinely committed over time to trying to get taxes down. And there's a bit of a gap in the market for that. Labour's trying to reclaim that territory that it had at the general election, but has clearly lost it. I have a lot of sympathy for my colleagues, my former colleagues, going into this, what is going to be a really, really difficult conference. A difficult conference because people are just not going to pay any attention.
You are right. It's if Keir Starmer's speech was a bit make or break for him on Tuesday, it's definitely a make or break conference for Kemi Badenoch, and she's going to pull the focus even more onto her by having two speeches rather than one. So she's got to deliver twice. She's going to talk, I think, about immigration and the European Convention at the beginning of the week to try to get onto the economy. You were, I think, talking a week or so ago about Ian Duncan Smith and his quiet man speech, and then the quiet man gets a bit louder. I can't remember the exact
turning
phrase.
Up the volume. The quiet man's here to stay, and he's turning up the volume. But it turned out about 3 weeks later, he was gone.
Kemi Badenoch is turning up the volume. She's going to be totally in the spotlight. Right. Can she make the argument that you're saying she should make? I think you're totally right, and be heard. That is the big test.